We'll start. Andreas, we're hearing from you, and then at 11 o'clock we're hearing from Mayor Tim Cadogan from Central Otago. Mayor, about he was on the working group set up by DAA alongside LGNZ. We are not having any presenters from the Coalition for Local Democracy. We had that at the last meeting. We had Helen Warboys with the consultant Malcolm Alexander supporting, and nor are we having anyone from LGNZ, because as Councillor Vincent actually got it wrong the other day, LGNZ don't have a position on the Three Waters reforms. So I thought, if there's no position and we're not backing a model, then why would we get LGNZ to speak? So we thought, well, we've heard from the coalition about their kaupapa. We need to hear about the model that they're proposing. So we really appreciate you taking time to be here, Andreas. But just bear in mind, you've got an hour. If you please make it, half an hour, and then we can have some questions. And if we wrap up before Tim Cadogan gets here, we can all go and have a coffee and be back here for 11. How's that?
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, Mayor McDowell. I'll certainly try and keep to that time and try and keep it concise and for you all. So I'll just start sharing my screen. I've got a bit of a presentation. I understand you've been shared it, and it's got a lot of information in there. So, but I won't talk through every single slide. It's more just so you've got all the information there as well. So here we go. I'm hoping you can all see that. Just a few nods be helpful for me. You seeing that? Are you seeing my presentation?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay,
good.
Thanks. Okay.
Excuse me, is this the same presentation that's on LG Hub?
I don't know what LG Hub. So I sent a PDF to Mike Firmo yesterday.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It will be the same one, Rob.
Thank you.
LG Hub yesterday.
So I've made a couple of tweaks to it overnight that I just thought would help a bit as well, but very, very small tweaks. Great. So thank you for the invitation to speak. My name's Andreas Heuser. I work at Castalia. I lead the New Zealand water practice. We're a global firm. We specialise in water reform, and we've worked across all of the major water governance and delivery systems, the French, American and British systems. We've done billions of dollars of projects around the world. The firm actually started as in the 70s and 80s to take the French model of regulation of water services by contract to the developing world. And we've since taken the business on into electricity, but still a heavy focus on water. So currently working on projects in Africa, the Middle East, and here in New Zealand, and in the Caribbean on water reform. So I just wanted to give you a quick note on our scope of work. So it was an invitation to come and speak to you. So it's not in any way advice that I'm giving. It's just a perspective on the analysis and advice I've recently given to communities for local democracy. And it's built on, so just in the New Zealand context, 5 years of work for other clients, including DIA, Local Government New Zealand, Watercare, and a range of local authorities. So I'm going to give you an executive summary, rip through that in a few minutes, then talk about shared objectives, the policy process and my perspective on that, talk about some of the particular issues that that highlight how the reform process has had flaws. Then I'll talk about the criteria that we've used to evaluate different options. and then get into the meat of the presentation, which is really, we looked at 3 options for 3 waters and find that of 3 options, which are kind of representative options, and that the mega entity proposal, the mega merger that the government's pursuing performs worst. And I'll give you the results of that. And then if we have time and if the questions get into it, I've got a couple of appendices which have more information. So just to executive summary, you know, the very clear case for change. There are very clear problems in the New Zealand water sector, and something needs to be done. It's a critical well-being issue. It's so important that the sector performs well. But the reform process has been flawed, and it's produced a flawed outcome. And the selection of this mega model was premature, and it has not properly considered the available evidence and the alternatives. And credible alternative models deserve analysis, which has not to date occurred. And we've done that. So we've really done the job that DIA should have done with its consultants, and have been working with local authorities for communities for local democracy to provide that constructive assistance. So we look at 3 models that are representative, and they're across a spectrum. So we go from council owned, but it's not council owned as is the case today. It's council owned plus a proper regulatory framework, which hasn't existed for 60 years. You know, for example, Ministry of Health has only pursued 1 prosecution in the 60 years it was responsible for drinking water quality. So we're saying council owned plus regulation, and some enhancements of the model as it exists today. Then council owned enterprise. The Communities for Local Democracy are calling this a council owned regional enterprise core model, which is, well, we can get into that, but it's essentially councils would have a shareholding in a regional company. And then the other model we looked at is the mega entity proposal, which is as proposed by the government. And so here are the results of the evaluation. And across the 7 criteria that we've used, we find that the council owned plus regulation or the council owned regional enterprise score best, and the mega entity proposal, when you look at the 7 criteria, performs worse. So that's the executive summary, and I'll just get into the presentation proper now. So as I said, and as I think we all agree, reform of the water sector is needed. There are major problems in some locations with the water sector. So there are some images on screen that have kind of been in the headlines. And of course, it's different problems in different areas. But overall, there's a consensus that management needs to improve, investment should increase, and regulation should improve. And of course, we've now got Taumata Arawai, which is responsible for water quality regulation, and we'll pick up that role in earnest sort of now, and then we'll take on more functions in environmental outcome regulation, supporting the frontline role of regional councils. And there is a proposal for economic regulation, which has come in really late in the piece, and we've put in a submission on behalf of Communities for Local Democracy that looks at the economics and of that, and really in summary, that's not going to perform very well with the mega entity proposal. In fact, it would be a globally unique system of economic regulation in the water sector. So I want to now talk about objectives. I think everybody agrees, and local government and the Communities for Local Democracy's objectives, I think, are very consistent with central government's. So it's to provide safe water services, to improve outcomes for iwi Māori, to lift resilience and reliability, particularly in the with a changing climate and increased extreme weather events. Its resilience and reliability is very, very important. Ensure that So this is your lovely pictures covering that bit of the slide. Ensure the water provision is the tariffs, so that the fees people pay for the water are fair, improve customer responsiveness, and make sure it's least cost, so it's not a gold-plated, over-engineered, expensive system, and improve environmental outcomes. But and of course, I said that it's very important for well-being, and with such a major transformation, you would expect that a standard policy process would be followed. That is, state the case for change, which I've just done, state the reform objective, develop criteria to evaluate options, identify options, develop a theory of change. So that means, like, you have an option, and what is the theory of change? How does this particular option achieve the outcomes and change things so that we will achieve the outcomes we're all looking for? And then you should evaluate options based on relevant, reliable, and transparent information. And unfortunately, this process has not been followed, and a preferred entity design was chosen well before options were properly identified and evaluated, which is why Communities for Local Democracy, and in our advice to LGNZ in 2020, we were saying this should happen. And if the options, the available options from all the global evidence should be properly identified and evaluated. And so, just to give you an example of how flawed this process has been, so the DIA appointed the Scottish water regulator to do some analysis of New Zealand, and essentially the modelling was crude, and this is where the $185 billion of investment needed figure comes from. And when we look at Whanganui District Council's officers' estimates of CapEx, so investment needed over the next 10 years, we find like a massive gap between what Wix has modelled in a top-down way compared to what your own officers have come up with. And sure, the officers' estimates, which they provided to the DIA, may be understated, but are they $100 million understated for asset replacement, and are they $423 million understated for enhancement and growth? I'd say probably not. And so there's you know, the truth might be somewhere in that in between the black line and the blue line, in that grey area, but it's probably closer to the blue line than the black line. And this analysis has been repeated across the country. And that's not to say that you know, there are massive investment needs in many places, but the headline number of 185 billion over 30 years has been reached with some, you know, implausible, is implausible, we say, and has been reached with some dubious techniques. So now I'm going to talk about the criteria for evaluating options. So as I said, we have pointed out that criteria for evaluating options were not identified early in this process, and the sort of Scottish mega model was settled on very early on. And so we provided criteria on behalf of LGNZ to the Joint Steering Committee, which was made up of, you know, chaired by Brian Hanna, and it had a range of local government, central government representatives. And these 7 criteria we think, not particularly controversial. There were no objections raised to them at the time, and the 7 criteria are, and it's important to separate these things, because people confuse, say, oh, the benefits of scale with the ability to raise finance. They say, oh, well, you need to be bigger to be able to raise the money that's needed for the investment. But actually, raising finance for investment is a separate criterion to whether getting bigger provides any benefits. So that's why I think it's very important to disaggregate all of these criteria, and that's what we've done. So we've said it's important, first of all, that the water service delivery is accountable to customers. So if something goes wrong, the water user, the customer, pick up the phone, and there's someone that's accountable at the end of the phone and will fix whatever the issue is, or they can influence the governance and therefore the management. Will the reform improve iwi Māori partnership? Obviously, very critical issue that's been agreed across local and central government. Does the option improve competence of management and operations? So it's very important that management and operations game is lifted. I think there's a widespread consensus that we need to improve the way water services are managed and operated. Will management and governance, will their incentives be aligned with the objectives? And I outlined what the objectives were at the beginning, safe, resilient, reliable water services that's environmentally sound at least cost. Will management and governance deliver on those objectives? Do they have the incentives to do that? The fifth criterion, are providers able to reliably raise the finance needed for investment? So many councils face constraints in raising debt to finance 30 or 50-year assets. And so what they're doing in the case of water care, they're charging higher water bills over the next 10 years to pay for assets that are going to last 30 or 50 years. So in 20, 30, 40 years, the users of those assets that are getting water services are going to have lower bills compared to what they would have had if you've been able to raise finance that lasted the life of the asset. The sixth criterion, does the option achieve economies of scale and scope? So this means by getting bigger, do you lower the cost of service? So by getting, and that's the idea that, as you get bigger, you can merge systems, or, you, instead of having 67 officers responsible for water services throughout the country, you're going to have 4 CEOs. So that could be a benefit of scale. And will you achieve economies of scope? So for a very obvious example, roading and stormwater are quite aligned. And there's an economy of scope where you have one entity that's responsible for the roading and the stormwater because they're closely interrelated. And you can, or urban planning and water provision, there's an economy of scope there. And so we look at whether the option achieves economies of scale and scope. And the final one is, will the option be flexible and adapt to change and new information? And with the climate changing and with population growth and decline in various places, with a need to change the way we provide water services, we want to have a system that is flexible and adapts and changes when new information presents itself. So say population growth, and we need to invest. So we looked at the 3 models across the spectrum. So the first model is council owned plus regulation. And here you see the various levels. So communities, councils, the governance level, the management level, the networks. So, in each council area, there are discrete water networks, and then the customers in the local community. So we looked at council owned plus regulation, council owned regional enterprise. So there are more councils at the council level. Then you would have a professional board that's appointed by the councils and iwi. Water company management that is accountable to the board, and then various networks and a regional community of customers. And then the mega entity proposal, which has up to 22 communities and represented by up to 22 councils, up to 68 iwi. That's according to Statistics New Zealand definition of iwi and iwi rohe, So that's in your entity B, so that would have up to 68 different iwi groups. That appoints a regional representative group, which appoints an independent selection panel, which appoints a board, which then oversees management, which oversees dozens of discrete water networks and services, which serves a pan-regional community. So looking at, and I'll just go into detail here. So this is the council-owned plus regulation model. So we're not talking about the status quo, we're talking about local community elects the council, which provides water services, and you've got the, but sitting off to the side, you've got central government, which may provide funding, so where communities face affordability challenges. And from what I've seen, I don't think that is Whanganui district, but say some of the areas that have large regions and have services that say provide to tourists as well, not just locals, and don't have the rating base to make water services affordable. And then on the right hand side, got regulators. So we're talking about an economic regulator that has monitoring and enforcement powers. So if the water service from the council is not performing, there are credible regulatory interventions, say recommend a merger with your neighbour, or appoint a manager, or and definitely benchmarking performance of councils against one another, which doesn't exist today, and it doesn't exist on drinking water quality. I mean, Water New Zealand puts out their performance report, but that's pretty high level, and not all councils participate, and it doesn't have complete information. So we're talking about like proper regulation that's common around the world, which hasn't been in place in New Zealand. And then the council-owned regional enterprise, and that's a similar situation with the regulators off on the side, but regulating a regional or unitary water company that's overseen by a professional board, which has its board members appointed by councils and or iwi, so we don't express a view on that. Overseeing networks and customers. And then what's important is no single council would control the entity, so would not have accounting rules control, and that avoids balance sheet consolidation. Or the final model is the government's mega entity model, which, as you can see, is fairly complex. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers between customers and so voters and the management. And so if there's anything, the accountability of this entity to its customers is fairly complex. So there are these multiple layers of appointment to get to the board, which oversees the management. And then there are all these reports and statements of performance that sort of overlay that. And then sitting to the side are the regulators, and also a consumer body, and also central government setting government's policy statement. So just to bring you back to then, once we run through the results, and the detailed results are put in the appendix, so you can read that at your leisure if you're interested. So when we look at accountability for customers, because of the more direct relationship between voters, councils, and the management of the water service, accountability to customers is pretty good. Similarly with the council-owned enterprise, but with the mega entity proposal, very poor accountability to customers. On iwi Māori partnership, we find, because the model we find is more efficient really, and more accountable to customers, it scores better on the iwi Māori partnership line. And like, we're not professing to be experts in this area at all. It's just when we do our economic and policy evaluation of the model and how it's structured, we reach this outcome. Management and operational performance, we score that as sort of middling to better score with some enhancements, and it scores very well on the regional enterprise, and pretty good because you do have large and will probably become like, well, they'll be very large mega entities with a greater ability to attract higher paid professional staff. The incentives on management and governance scores pretty well on council owned plus regulation and council owned enterprise, regional enterprise, but poorly for the mega entity. And that is because you have more direct accountability of management and the governance to the customers. With the mega entity proposal, that is quite an indirect relationship, and there are conflicting accountability mechanisms and we've pointed this out in the submission to the to MB on the economic regulation in particular. Like, there are very conflicting objectives there. Access to financing, at the moment, many councils have difficulty raising the finance needed for investment, and there are really inconsistent ways of calculating the cost of service and therefore how much finance would be needed. And we're saying, like, with some targeted enhancements, so economic regulation, for example, and potentially funding support for communities that have an affordability challenge, that could improve. And council-owned enterprise with a separate balance sheet, access to financing would be much better, and the mega entity proposal scores quite well on that because they will be the largest corporations in New Zealand by balance sheet size and able to raise debt very easily by themselves. Scale and scope efficiencies. So the mega entity proposal, to the extent that scale efficiencies exist, will achieve those, but will tend towards diseconomies of scope and will lose any diseconomies of scale, sorry, and will lose economies of scope because we're disconnecting water services from roading, from urban planning. So any economies of scope that did exist are lost. The regional enterprise model scores very well on scale and scope efficiencies. So to the extent that scale efficiencies are available, and we say they're actually quite small relative to the total cost of water services, so nowhere near the 50% saving that the government claims with WICS, that those scale efficiencies can be maximised at the regional level, and the scope efficiencies, given that the government's proposing to make urban planning more on a regional basis as well. And on council owned plus regulation, it's a sort of middling score because there are opportunities to generate economies of scale and they're not being taken advantage of. But with some enhancements, so a regulator that actually has some ability to drive outcomes, that could improve. And flexibility for the future. So as a smaller unit of management, it scores quite well, but council-owned enterprise scores less well because it's just bigger and less responsive to local needs and local changes. But the mega entity proposal scores very poorly, just also because of its governance structure. So we find sort of like on our evaluation, we find that the council-owned regional enterprise scores best. So that's really the whirlwind rip through of the presentation. And so I did provide some answers to kind of anticipated feedback. And I just thought it'd be useful if I've just used this slide. And if you want to look in detail, I do have some information that is here where you can read all about it. But if I just go, I'm coming back to the slide that gives an overview. So I just want to give some answers to anticipated feedback. So the first was, well, there's this assumption and it's been in place since the beginning and we debunked it on behalf of LG&Z and it hasn't been addressed front on, and that is that you need to have a minimum of 800,000 connections to get the cost savings that are apparently there. But the government's totally misread and its consultants misread the evidence. there are limited scale benefits from an administrative merger. So just by merging the administration of water services does nothing to lower the costs of building and managing water networks. So Whanganui town's water network and reticulated water supply and wastewater network isn't going to merge with Hawera's or Martin's or Palmerston North's. So it's not like electricity where you get pretty clear economies of scale from having a big network. Water is highly localized and it's historical. We built our water networks close to water sources and built them, and you don't transport water very far because it's quite expensive to put it in wastewater pipes and pump it for miles and miles to a wastewater treatment plant. So your wastewater treatment plant tends to be close to the population centre. And so I've got some maps here, like in Wellington. Wellington has had drinking water supplied from Wainuiomata since 100 years ago, but no significant integration of physical water networks has occurred since then. And so none of these like physical networks are going to be merged with one another. So that's why the economies of scale argument is pretty flimsy. You might get some operating savings, so you're going to have fewer CEOs, but then the government's also promised no job losses. So that doesn't really stack up when you that economies of scale argument. The second point is that council-owned enterprises cannot raise finance independently. Now, DIA's never addressed this question head on, and they did not ask Standard & Poor's whether having council-owned regional model would achieve balance sheet separation. So they didn't ask the question. They only focused on whether their preferred model would do that. So again, not looking at the available options and with a predetermined outcome, we say. The third point is that solutions do not work for Watercare and Auckland Council. Well, Auckland has got its own legislation and got its own model. So, but there are solutions that could be used for Auckland. But so why does the tail, Auckland, wag the dog, New Zealand? So why are we designing a water reform that would work for Auckland but apply it to the rest of New Zealand? And Mayor Goff provided some pretty interesting feedback on the joint working group's findings. So I encourage you to read that. Like, he gives a very interesting perspective on Auckland. And the affordability. So some communities will face affordability challenges. Well, the point we're saying is somebody has to pay for water services, and the joint, the mega entity merger model, instead of having a community affected pay for their own water services, they are spreading the cost over, from Tairāwhiti to Golden Bay, or from, in your case, Whanganui, all the way to the Bombay Hills. So that everyone's going to pay the same water bill, but there are highly different systems, and each, some water systems just cost more because there's more pipe, the houses are further apart, or so where there are affordability challenges in the roading system, we address that by having funding assistance rates for deprived communities, but that has not even been properly looked at. It's just an assumption that, okay, let's get big, let's cross subsidize within the area so everyone pays the same water rate, and that doesn't actually address the affordability challenge. It just makes everyone pay the same thing, and it's inefficient for a number of reasons. And then they say that regional models have been proposed and shown not to work. Well, we say they haven't been examined properly. The only region that's really done it properly is Hawke's Bay, and I think that they found that actually the regional model could work quite well. So those are the sort of anticipated feedback points, and if you want to read it, it's all here. And and then in detail I go into we've got 14 slides on the evaluation criteria, so you can read up on how we reached the view that we did. And, we're not purporting here to say that, that we've got the perfectly formed answer, that we know. We've used representative models, and there's more work needed on how exactly they would work. But having done the work that, the government didn't really do, we find that so if I just go back to the, headline slide here, find that, these two left-hand side models perform better than the mega entity proposal. So I think 34 minutes I managed. So I hope that I wasn't too quick, but I just wanted to leave some time for Q&A.
No, look, thank you very much, Andreas. There will be questions, and I've got a couple I just want to float early on. And thank you for your analysis of the WIX models that you did for LGNZ back last year. It was extremely insightful, and it was obvious that WIX is just wrong. As our former chief executive said, we sweat the assets here. When you've got public assets, you don't just repair it because it's on the program. You have a look at it and go, and I totally agree with you that it's not the way you make policy. I've been very clear on that from the start. I think they've got it around the wrong way. You'd start with the future for local government, then you'd do the RM reform, and then you would have given Taumata Arawai the chance to breathe and start pinging some of the councils who have underinvested all over the country, and you watch them start to investing in pipes. Look, one thing I thought, it's on this page, and I didn't like your answer, is about the iwi Māori partnership. You seem to be equating the iwi Māori partnership. You acknowledged you're not an expert in this, but you seem to be equating it with, it's better for the general population, so it's going to be better with iwi Māori. That's what I heard. Can you expand on that if I got that wrong?
That's yeah, frankly, yeah. So not quite what I said or what I meant. So what I'm saying is that the model is more efficient. It is more responsive to local needs, and therefore, provided whatever government and local government decide and say is the appropriate representation of iwi Māori, it will work better at a smaller level. So, for example, I said that there are 68 iwi in entity B, which is the entity that Whanganui would be in, and they get 5 seats on the regional representation group. So 68 people have iwi representing diverse hapu and whānau have to appoint 5 representatives. And we're saying, well, given that water services and the environmental outcomes and the te mana o te wai is basically experienced at the whānau hapu level, that a model that is closer to that is going to perform better. That's really why we evaluate those models as better than the mega entity.
And so you'd agree with the working group's report on that then, because your mega entity proposal hasn't incorporated the working group's recommendations. You'd be supporting the working group's recommendations? No.
So I wouldn't. So I don't support. I don't sort of take a view on the working group's recommendations on iwi Māori, but I don't think.
No, but just right across this the slide you got here, mega energy proposal.
Yeah.
The working group's enhancements, admittedly within confines of certain things, would change some of those dials, surely.
So it would change access to financing, because the under the working group's proposal, that councils would have a direct ownership that's capped of the entities. So Auckland will be capped at below 50, but still the access to financing would be poorer. The accountability to customers is still poor, but I mean, the management and operational performance is still, I mean, all it does is it tweaks if we go to here on the right hand side, it tweaks the entity governance arrangements. It just removes regional governance and independent selection panel, but still you've got 22 councils needing to agree on board appointments.
Sure, but it does collapse the governance structure, which you've already said is part of that thing. So I think part of the reason that some of these things, the dials are red. So I just,
I'm not saying I accept or endorse what they've said. No, what I think was the original question.
All right, and last thing, your access to financing and the council owned plus regulation thing, you said it will improve, you believe, with targeted design improvement. Is that by embracing the Waka Kotahi model?
Well, there are various ways you could improve it, but one of which is, so if the issue is that you can't finance because people can't afford to pay the sorts of rates that would be needed to service the debt that's needed for long-term investment, well then there's there could be targeted financing regimes where the bit that can't be serviced is provided by government, for example. That's one. Just having economic regulation and a uniform way of reporting on and setting water bills would be an improvement and would enable enable you to access finance a little easier, I'd say. And so there's a range of things you could do. So, but just as it is without those arrangements, which we acknowledge, like work needs to be done on what those are, you're still in the orange dial camp.
Yep. The Waka Kotahi model, we get a far rate for, road improvements and Whanganui. It's not just on deprivation, it's only one parameter, but I know you know that. However, for the bigger projects, it goes to a regional transport committee and then the prioritization is made. And they're the ones that attract the Waka Kotahi funding over a region. And so something like the Dublin Street Bridge in Whanganui, which is quite important to Whanganui people, but might be 8, 9 or 10 on the scale of priorities, because the Manawatu Gorge and the Otaki to north of Levin things are higher. How do you see that being in comparison to what you're suggesting about the Waka Kotahi model for individual projects? Because we might be considering $80 million for our stormwater, which is going into the river, and one day that will be required to be improved. Yeah, there's $800 million over in Palmerston North. Surely they'll get a priority because of the A amount and B the service requirement for in terms of population.
So yeah, I think the Waka Kotahi model provides funding where there are regional projects or national national highways, for example. So there's a they assess roads and needs based on a framework of like where the benefits, I guess, are also falling. But with water networks, the benefits are mostly local, and then you want to have like minimum service standards. But I think the same thing is going to occur at the with the regional amalgamation. You're still going to have to get prioritisation of Whanganui projects within prioritised at the board level of entity B, which is
So it's a problem.
Tauranga and Hamilton of high growth, and
So it's a problem for both your model and it's a problem for your model and the mega entity.
Yeah, so we're saying do the work. Let's do the work. There are global models that are applicable here that haven't really been looked at, which we think is like the next logical step here to do.
Cool. Okay, thank you, Andreas. That's my questions. I would go down the chain, but I see Mike's got his hand up. Do you want to go now, Mike, or Mike's our Chief Financial Officer, before we go to the elected officials, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you, Hamish. I've got a couple questions or concerns, and thanks, Andreas, for your presentation. A lot of what you said, we agree, officers would agree with. And the questions or concerns I've got won't be a surprise to you, because I briefly talked to you about these on the phone. And it's around the funding aspect of it. So from the Standard & Poor's reactions to the government's proposals in the draft legislation, which was a large amount of council representatives on the regional representation group, they stated there was not enough level of balance sheet separation. So under accounting rules, if balance sheet separation is achieved under accounting rules, doesn't necessarily is achieved for funding agencies or rating agencies. And I'd suggest under a regional model where there's very close governance to the councils, that it certainly wouldn't be achieved under a regional model. So that being the case, then the regional model would not have the access to the funding levels that a mega model would have, and certainly a standalone model wouldn't have access to the financing. Now, for Wanganui, if we were to be part of a regional entity, we've got $400 million of assets and we've got $80 million of debt. I'm uncertain of how that stuff gets transferred to the regional model. One of the concerns of the Community for Local Democracy was that there was a transfer of assets to these mega entities, but there was no recognition and financial recognition of those assets. So unless the regional model is prepared to pay $400 million for our assets, then it's the same issue being applied. And I would suggest that if they took over a debt of $80 million, not having balance sheet separation, they wouldn't be able to access the finance needed to do the work going forward. On top of that, what I see here is a lot of cross-subsidisation. So for example, the standalone entity, given that Wanganui is in quite a good place in the short to medium term of its assets, we would have to fund our assets as they are in a long-term plan, plus increased regulation. And I think I agree with you that the cost of our networks going forward is somewhere between what's in a long-term plan and what Wix is suggesting. So there will be increased cost to council. On top of that, we'd have to fund the increased regulation and would have to provide subsidies to a national fund to help those councils that can't afford the work. So from a funding perspective, I see issues with both the regional model and the standalone entity, which I'm not sure is going to benefit Wanganui, particularly if we look at a region around us, both to the north and south and so on, there's councils that have funding or issues with their networks. So that's questions or statements from me.
Sure. So I think on the financing point, the issue still stands that it's never been properly looked at. We're just inferring things from things Standard & Poor's have said, but and financing has not been addressed as a separate issue, which I've done here. So there are, myriad of ways you can improve access to financing. So, for example, revenue bonds are very common internationally, haven't really been looked at properly. Here, we seem to be, always trying to come up with a bespoke New Zealand solution for infrastructure financing when there are very obvious models around the world that could be used. Your second point was really around, so what happens when the assets are transferred into whatever the entity is that comes out of this. So whether it's the mega entity, so that there's no compensation, or it's just we promised that you're going to pay a uniform rate on water for 30 years. Whereas like historically, when these mega entities have been proposed, I mean, in the UK from 72 to 89, there was a disaster, and those 10 regional public entities, similar to what we're proposing here, ended up being privatised, and in the intervening period, ended up being controlled by central government because the balance sheets were effectively central governments, which is probably what's going to happen here too. And then on funding, I mean, then the question of like, well, how do you value the assets or the liabilities that are transferred into the whatever the entity is, whether it's the council-owned enterprise or whether it's just a council direct 100% owned subsidiary. Well, that is a process that would have to be worked through. There would have to be some process and compensatory mechanisms so that and absolutely agree that is a key issue, but it's not avoided in the mega entity model either. And then I think your last point was around you've got significant kind of a capex program and costs will go up. Well, I guess costs are going to go up in all scenarios, and the only issue is some other part of New Zealand going to subsidise you or not, or are you going to subsidise another area? I think those are all key issues that haven't really been exposed and need to be worked through when you do the detailed design of like how the regional entity would be constructed, or with the mega entity. Like you're going into this with 30 years of are your tariffs that local residents will pay, are they going to be quote unquote fair given the level of assets you went into it with? So
thanks, Andreas. My last point on the cross subsidisation was not so much a question, it's just being aware that regardless of what model we use, Wanganui will have to do initially some cross subsidisation. So these two models you propose doesn't actually avoid that scenario. It's kind of more a statement than a question.
Yeah, I agree. But if you are negotiating with your assets and on entry to a regional model, you're in a better position than if the government's mandating that you join one of the four. So that's the only comment. I guess you'd have a bit more control if it's a negotiated process.
Thank you.
Councillor Vincent.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you, Andreas, for your presentation. I note that your firm has been consulted with by LGNZ for a long period of time, probably going back to a 2013 report. I think that you first looked at this issue of Three Waters for LGNZ. You then looked at it again and produced reports in 2020. Now, was there any material change between your conclusions in 2013, your conclusions in your 2020 report, and how you feel about it today, knowing that these 4 entities have been mandated. I can't hear anything here.
Yeah, sorry, I'd have to go back and look at what exactly we said in 2013, but I think we've been pretty consistent that you know, there are reforms that are needed, and it's important to follow an appropriate process that takes into account all the best available information and evidence, and is a contestable process. So yeah, I think we're being consistent, I guess, if that answers the question.
Yeah. The LGNZ chose not to forward that report, the 2020 report, to the member councils for at least 7 or 8 months. What was the conclusion in that report in terms of the government model?
Pretty clear. So we did 3 bits of work. The first one said, LGNZ, you need to insist on independent criteria to evaluate options, and that's the same criteria I went through today, or 6 of the 7. And then the second report was looking at the economies of scale that the evidence that Wix was coming up with, and saying that there were these massive, you know, savings that could be achieved by merging councils. You know, one example was if you merged Auckland and the South Island, and then had the rest of the North Island in 2 entities. So Auckland and the South Island, 1 entity, rest of the North Island, another entity. That would be the cheapest option, would achieve the biggest cost savings, like kind of absurd results like that. We went through and kind of looked at that, and looked at actually the evidence of economies of scale, and I referenced some of that in the slide deck today. And the third bit of work was looking at, like, when countries have gone through reform processes, what's been the outcome, and looked at, like, local government owned and operated, regional public corporation, regional private corporation, which is England and Wales. There are 9 of them there. And then finally was an outsourced model, and we kind of did an evaluation of those. So I can't comment on why that wasn't released to LGNZ's members. It was well received at the time, and by LGNZ. I don't know why they didn't provide it on.
So just the final question about the cross-subsidisation is one of my major concerns about the proposed model. Under a regional model, would all councils be compelled to be a member of a region, or would it be a situation where, for instance, Kapiti may join up with Wellington Water, and Wairarapa may join up, so that becomes a regional model on a voluntary basis?
Well, so this is the work that I think we're going to do next. Like, we've been going, Communities Local Democracy, the client's been going since what, October, November last year, more or less. And so we produced this kind of rapid fire. And the next kind of phase is, well, what would it actually look like? And my personal view on this is a kind of arbitrated model where it's like, okay, you've got 3 years to get this done. We're going to give you, central government is going to give you a framework of how it should look. And here are the minimum standards that Taumata Arawai is developing, in terms of, like, you have to hit this water quality standard and your environmental outcomes have to be this. And then here is, and there are some options on the table, for example, regional amalgamations. And then it's up to, say, Kapiti to decide whether they go north or whether they go south, or Wairarapa equally, like, do they go together with Payatua and Tarua and Dannevirke and so on, or do they go south? Similar for Whanganui. And I think it's kind of, there are some minimum things that need to be hit, and then it's kind of, you've got 3 years to talk amongst yourselves, basically. But if you don't achieve the outcome by the end of that period, then there are some hard decisions that get made and kind of enforced by a referee of sorts.
Well, that seems pretty sensible, because I don't think we want to go into a region with Palmerston North, for instance.
Right.
Or New Plymouth, in fact, or Rupehu, Manawatu. Tararua is not looking flash. Okay, Graham.
Thank you, Hamish. Just thank you, Andreas, for your thing. Could you just give me, it appears that Castalia were involved with DIA, as you've said, I think in 2017 through. What was the issue that did not allow you people to sort of continue along the path with DIA?
Well, I guess DIA makes its own decisions on who it appoints. I think we expressed interest in working on the reforms, but we've got the global background and the experience, I guess, in these models, and have an open mind about what the best outcome is. And looking at the evidence, we've come up with what I've said today. So I don't know. I can't comment on why they didn't appoint us. They appointed, so for some of the stuff they've appointed the Scottish consultants.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you very much, Andreas. I really appreciate your time. I know you've got to head away to something. Feel free to stay on for a little longer. We're going to hear from Tim Cadogan from the working group now. I think he's here somewhere. Oh, yeah, there he is. He's just popped on. That's brilliant. Yeah, morning, Tim. So thank you, Andreas. And morning, Tim. Just from the beautiful Central Otago, I just want to explain, you were one of 10 mayors, was it, who joined with 9 mayors who joined with iwi leaders, and it was a working group that was really developed at the behest of LGNZ. But you're not you're an LGNZ member, but you're not on the council or speak for LGNZ.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so there were two council representatives appointed from each entity, plus one who was a rural and provincial delegate, just to make sure that voice got across extra loudly. So yeah, there were 9 of us, but I've got a presentation if we want to go through that. Hamish, does that work for you?
Please, far away.
Probably, kia ora, councillors, probably the easiest way to do this is to get this slide presentation out of the way and do questions at the end. Otherwise, we can go off track. I haven't got a huge slide presentation. You'll be glad to hear that. So, look, the first thing I want to say is I'm not here to sell the government's plan. I went into that working group with a very clear view that unless there's a change of government come mid-2024, this proposal was going to go ahead, and this was an opportunity to try to fine-tune it, make it better if at all possible, because I didn't want to wake up on the 1st of July 2024 and think, gee, we could have done this better. So that's why I was involved in it. It's been probably easily 100 hours extra work, and but it was enjoyable. It was a lot of fun. It was quite challenging. So the members of the group, those are your council members. Lynn Patterson from Masterton was the other, the added-on mayor for rural.
Are you sharing your?
Yeah, are you able to see my screen?
Can't see.
Oh, bugger. Okay. All right. Well, I've forwarded it through, so your team can do that. Let's see if I push another button and actually do it right this time. That might make a huge difference. You got it now?
That's pretty good.
Huh. Brilliant. Okay. Well, that got us off to a flying stop, but we're good now. Is that full screen for you guys? Yeah. Or let's see if I can make it full screen. Righto. Okay. So that's your. Can you see the mayors there? Great. And these are the iwi representatives. They were all extremely good to work with. Right. So the terms of reference are really important in understanding the mahi that we had to go through, and there were 4 train tracks that we couldn't really deviate from. 1, balance sheet separation. 2, giving effect to the government's view of the Crown's Treaty of Waitangi obligations. 3 was ensuring good government through roles and good governance through roles and responsibilities. And 4, making sure the spectre of privatisation didn't get to rear its ugly head. Now, I just want to check that councillors are aware of the exposure draft changes, because I'm sure you're all aware of the government's plan, but they did, when they put out the exposure draft, make some changes to it. So these are they. Each rural representative group can determine its own arrangements through a constitution rather than in primary legislation. This one, I thought the second one was fairly interesting. There were 6 + 6 council representatives and iwi representatives in the original draft. I think under pressure from council saying, how do we get the local voice in? They raised that to as many members as there were councils. Now, I'm not sure, it was either entity B or C that would wind up with a rural representative group of 44 members, which I hope you would all agree would be fairly unworkable. Also importantly to me was that board appointments and removals under the exposure draft were to be made by a committee of the RRG rather than an independent selection panel. That remains, and it still worries me, frankly. The board will be directly accountable to the RRG for performance of the duties imposed on the board. And again, the RRG can remove board members for failing to carry out these duties. And the board required to give effect to the statement of strategic and performance expectations. That was a more direct influence than what was there in the original draft. We received 7 alternative models. So the process that the chair determined to go down was to look at alternative models and see what we could learn from each of them and put that into our thinking. Communities for Local Democracy, and I came in just at the end of their presentation, so I'm sure that you would have seen the 2 models they put forward. I've shortened them down to a CCO model and a government funding model. Auckland put in a CCO model. There was a co-op model, which was kind of it was more or less a public influenced CCO type model. There was a regional model that came to us from the mayors of the Hawke's Bay. So basically looking at smaller entities than what we have currently in front of us. We had a model put up by Ngāi Tahu that had very much shared governance arrangements right the way through to the board or in the committees going into the board, and also the Wellington Water model. And I've left it for last because despite Wellington Water's current issues, this was the one that probably sparked the most interest, because they said, and I think it came primarily from staff rather than governors, if we had our time again, here's how we'd like it to be set up for Wellington Water. So that influenced strongly some of what came out later on. So the big issues that we saw in front of us were ownership, the loss of the local voice, the risk of privatisation, and consumer protection. Obviously, in putting this presentation together, my own slant or bias can't help but come through, but they were the things we really wrestled with to a large extent. So the ownership model, I'm sure you know, under the current arrangement, each entity is collectively owned by the councils in the area. Huge amount of public concern about this, and unfortunately, ownership has become a forum for massive misinformation. There is a genuine feeling in communities that they're losing their assets. What hasn't been portrayed is councils will also lose their debts and their liabilities, but never mind. And ownership has also been a stick for some to hit iwi with, and I'm sure you've all received emails regarding the myth of iwi 50% ownership, iwi getting dividends out of the water, etc. So we settled on a shareholding system to potentially alleviate those concerns and to re-engage the ownership conversation, and it also crosses over into the privatisation discussion as well. So what we've recommended to the Minister is a shareholding system where each council and the entity will get 1 share per 50,000 people or part thereof. My apologies, I didn't check the population of your district before I came on, but if you've got 50,001 people in the, whatever it's going to be based on, the last census or the last stats department update, you would get 2 shares. Really important. There is no link between the shareholding and the governance numbers or influence. So there is a class of share under the Companies Act, which is simply reflective of ownership. So it's kind of based around that model. But remember I talked about how it's a stop to privatisation. or the only time there would be a shareholders vote is if there is to be a sale of the entity. And I call this the belts and braces and binder twine approach, because under the exposure draft, you already require 75% of the RRG to agree to sale. You would then require 75% of the public who vote, not the whole public, to agree to the sale. And under the shareholders arrangement that we put to government, it would then require 100% agreement amongst the shareholders to the sale as well. So that is another block to privatisation. I haven't done a model up for your entity, but you can just see here how it works out for my entity. Christchurch gets 8 shares. My little district with 25,000 people gets 1 share. Dunedin gets 3. Nothing really complicated about it. It's a very rough gauge. There was talk amongst the group about, well, why don't we actually do it based on the value of the assets you put in? But as I mentioned before, you can't put in something based on the value of the assets. You'd have a hell of a job getting agreement on a valuing exercise anyway, but then you would have to, the debts are fairly easy to value, but valuing the liabilities contingent upon some of those assets or the lack of them might be a lot trickier. So we just went for this simple method. The loss of the local voice, obviously a real concern. And I come from a small district, 24, 25,000 people at the bottom of the South Island, pretty hard to get heard. Presently, under the exposure draft, 1 seat for every council with corresponding iwi number for the RRG, 44 members in entity, I think it's B. That's just unworkable. We've got 40 in entity D. It just wouldn't work. So what we've recommended to the is regional or catchment subgroups to the RRG. We call them sub-RRGs. We had a lot of different names. It's up to each entity constitution how that's divided. So we had talked about, and the Wellington Water Model, which is where this came from, had split into 4 different subgroups, and each approximate council would go into it. So obviously you had the ones covered by Wellington Water Care at the moment. You had the ones in Te Waipunamu blocked in. I can't quite remember how it all worked. We've left it up to each entity, and a lot of that was to do with just the complexity of how different entity A is, with 4 different councils and one being massive compared to the rest. For us here in entity D, it could be as simple as a Southland and Otago, a Christchurch, a rest of Canterbury and a West Coast sub-RRGs, and each of them would have a member at the RRG table, so that you would have, if you're not at the top table, your council would be at the table next door. But it may also be actually better for us all to be broken up into, for instance, 2 urban, 2 rural, 2 provincial councils. The RRGs are going to have to sort that out, what's best for each area further down the track. And one thing that, as a mayor, I was pretty keen to push was that there's an open range of people who can be appointed to those seats. In an earlier draft or discussion document, the government had put to the idea that it would be mayors who sit on those sub-RRGs or the RRGs or whatever. Mayors aren't necessarily the best people and aren't necessarily the people who have the most time. And so what we've put is that it should be up to the councils to determine who the best people are. And they may not even be elected members. I'd be surprised if that was the outcome, but you need to leave the door open, we thought. Also, we've really boosted the power. There's a really fine line between the RRGs becoming so involved in the board management that you really start to cause some issues in terms of the capability of the board to do their job, but also in terms of that balance sheet separation. But we have recommended to the government the RRGs be given the power to approve the water entity's statement of intent. That goes beyond the ability to comment that was in the draft. RRGs are also given powers to comment on the water entity's operational direction in the asset management plan and other key documents. So that's to comment, so not as strong as approve. And we've also put that the Crown should consult with the RRGs in developing the GPS and follow the standard consultation process involved, including the communities. Risk of privatisation, we're getting near the end, folks. 2 recommendations aimed at making sale even harder. We've already talked about the shareholder unanimous agreement as per the previous slide. We've also recommended that there be entrenchment of the privatisation provisions. It's often said that current parliaments can't bind future parliaments, but we can and do to an extent. And two examples are the Bill of Rights Act and the part of the Electoral Act that goes towards the age of being able to vote. Both of those require a 75% majority of Parliament to change. We've recommended that that be put in place for the privatisation provisions only. So if a new government comes in and wants to get rid of the Three Waters reforms, the entities or whatever, they can do that. Go ahead, knock yourself out, but don't come in and think you're just going to sell it to the highest bidder, because that's, I think, for a lot of people, the biggest fear is every time a pensioner turns their tap on, there'll be a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, as there is every time she turns her light switch on. So hopefully that'll go through. I think that will require some cross-party support. In terms of consumer protection, we've also recommended a water ombudsman or something similar that enhances consumer protection at an individual level. Reason being that, you know, I get the occasional complaint. We're water metered here, and I've had 3 or 4 complaints where there's been a problem at the meter. There's a bit of an argument. Staff don't agree with the customer whose fault it is, who's going to pay. And I'm able to step in and go, look, let's try to work something out here. We're not going to be able to do that when there's an entity. It'd be like, you know, somebody gets a big power bill. How are you going to straighten that out as a mayor or a councillor? So we need somebody independent in there. For an example, the Victorian Energy and Water Ombudsman, they do, I believe, a superb job over there of just getting in and fixing those problems through a speedy resolution process. We've also, I think this is the last slide, confirmed and enhanced. We're strengthening Te Mana o Te Wai as the overarching korowai or cloak of the whole reform process. And we've put in code governance embracing Te Ao Māori to improve Three Waters service delivery and environmental protection up to but not including the board. So I'll stop sharing now and happy to take any questions through you, Hamish. Thank you, everybody. I hope that wasn't too onerous.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. Yeah, it was Entity B with the 44 members, so thank you for suggesting that that doesn't happen.
It's bonkers.
Yeah, it's bonkers. I'm looking for any yellow hands, any questions.
Sweet.
I think we all agree with you. That's
Put
great.
everyone to sleep.
No. Inevitably, Councillor Vincent.
Kia ora, Rob. Can't hear you. There you go.
Thank you for your presentation. Tim, in this community, we've got about $200 million worth of assets, approximately, and we're tipping this into this new entity.
Sorry, you're cutting out, Rob. You're frozen.
Maybe, Rob, take your video off because you're frozen. Still frozen. We'll come back to Rob. Any further questions of Tim?
I might have a guess at what Rob was talking, because I did sit in for about the last 3 minutes of the previous presentation, and I recognised Rob's concern about propping up other councils in the vicinity. So I hear that, and I'll come at that from a couple of angles. Keeping in mind, I'm not here to sell the government case, but we do need to do something. The 2 angles I'll come at from are this. I don't know about you guys in Whanganui, but we're one of the few rural and provincial councils to have water meters on all our supplies. We have done that for about 15 years. We've found 25% drop in OPEX. It has a significant impact on CAPEX as well. And about 80% of our customers got a lower water cost, because they weren't getting necessarily a bill before, but got a lower water cost. So it seems a no-brainer to us. So I can sit here and say, I can look at my brother's district in Clutha and go, the first thing they're going to do in Clutha, which is a neighbouring district, is put water meters in, and we're going to pay for those, because you've been too, I won't use the pejorative terms that I might, but you haven't done it yourselves. And that's not fair. And that will be the case for, we will be behind for a long period of time until they get those water meters in, because I think as any business, that's the first thing they're going to do. However, further down the track, I've got 92% of my treated wastewater going into rivers and lakes, and that's not going to be allowed to happen anymore. I'm quite sure that that's the way it's going to go. And I don't see how my community is going to be able to pay for that. So there's going to be swings and roundabouts. And the other thing I look at when I consider these big entities is we distritised our three waters in 2015 LTP. So up till then, our communities were paying various amounts for our water. And Cromwell, for instance, that's our biggest town now, it received a rates increase on average of about $200 when we distritised, whereas Alexandra, our second biggest town now, had a drop of $100. And people jumped up and down and screamed blue murder and went, that's not fair. The mayor at the time could probably claim that that lost him the job. I'd disagree because I actually supported the distritisation anyway. But what it meant was that our smaller communities, and we have some schemes on communities of a couple of hundred people that needed upgraded, they were never going to be able to do it, but they will be able to do it, and we could do it if we were going to be allowed to, because we're distritised. If we look at Aotearoa New Zealand, not just of now, but into the future, there may be an argument that bigger is better. And I look at Tasmania as a case model, and of course you can look at different case models, but Tasmania is one that I've looked at fairly closely, and it has worked out for them. We're a different place. We're a long, skinny island instead of a conveniently almost squarish one. But yeah, so that's how I look at it. That swings and roundabouts are probably going to even it up. Maybe not in this generation, but certainly over a long period of time. I hope that addressed that councillor's question, but if not, hopefully he'll be able to come back on.
Yeah, Rob, he's answered the question. Tim's answered the question around that he assumed you were asking about cross-subsidisation. Yeah. Now, Philippa.
Yeah, thank you. I guess a couple of points maybe, or kind of questions, or, you know, the terms of reference, some would suggest you're very hamstrung by them. And also this whole idea that, you know, with ownership comes rights, responsibilities and obligations. And no matter how you look at it, you know, I mean, the government started consulting, said it was going to let us do full consultation, basically cut us off, made decisions, and now they're trying to give a bit of a, let us, you know, try and appease us a little bit but with, you know, very tight terms of reference. But trying to separate ownership from the value of the assets, etc. So I guess that's kind of a bit of a statement. But, you know, how do we, you know, I mean, with all due respect, you know, around ownership, you know, and all due respect to Kaikoura with its 4,000 people, you know, we've got 67,000, and I mean, they've got one vote and we might get two. And you could use that in a few, you know, I mean, there's going to be a, you know, you get up to the size of the Aucklands. Obviously, Christchurch 8 votes. I don't know what Auckland's got, but it's going to be a heck of a lot more. But, you know, there's nothing, you know, there's nothing fair about any of this. So, you know, and it seems like you made a very bland kind of simple calculation. That's not a calculation and doesn't, you know, the whole ownership around, the whole separating ownership from value of assets is not actually answered. That's kind of a question.
Yeah, there's a bit in there, so I'll try to address it all, Philippa. So the terms of reference, yeah, look, definitely we were hamstrung by that, but, well, it depends on how you look at it. If our task was to come up with a whole new model and come up with a better one, then yeah, we were hamstrung. Our task was to improve the government model. So they were the train tracks that we had to run along. In terms of the ownership, yeah, look, I take your point about the shareholding. It doesn't directly apply. And as I said in my presentation, if we tried to work out the assets, the debts, and particularly the contingent liabilities into the future, there'd have been 5 years of litigation between the councils to work out who had what. But more importantly was the balance sheet separation. If you had the councils really starting to say, well, we're a shareholder, and take entity A, you know, if Auckland putting in 92% of the assets, not sure what the debts and liabilities would be, but 92% of the assets will come from Auckland, or maybe it's 92% of the population, whichever, it's around about that. They're huge. if they're too predominant in there in their ability to direct the board, some of the debt or that the entity could raise could be perilled, or indeed it could come back on Auckland if the entity failed because it had too much in it. I think for me, and again, I'm not here to sell the government's case, and there's elements of it that I'm not at all happy with, but I look at it this way. If you've got a car and your car's buggered because you haven't maintained it, and look, most people will say, yeah, that there's no council in the country will put its hand up and say, we're the one, or we're one of the ones that haven't done a good enough job. And I just come back to the water meter, sorry. Most councils haven't done good enough. So we've got cars that are buggered. There's going to be an outfit that's going to take that car away. They're going to do it up, hopefully at a lower cost, and you still get to use it. Because your communities, and people talk about the assets getting stolen. The assets aren't going anywhere. It's going to be the management. And is the management of the assets going to be done better by an entity board that is there entirely to run infrastructure, as opposed to councils that we do so many other different things. I was not and I'm still not, you know, I've had 6 years now of being the chair of a board of governors that handles infrastructure, but that's not the trade that I came into it with. So the question has to be, we've got this economic problem that's been caused by three things. One is the government not enforcing the drinking water standards. So to me, that's a 50-50 bet. Councils ignored them because central government didn't enforce them. So we've got a lot of catch up there. We've got the catch up about stopping putting our wastewater into rivers and streams. And we've got council neglect. And that's significant in a lot of the country. That's the economic problem we have to fix. Now, whether we can keep fixing that economic problem through 67 different organisations doing it 67 different ways is beyond me. Where I will agree, though, is the government could not probably have done a worse job of explaining to the public why they think we've got a problem and why they think their answer to that problem is the right one. They couldn't have done it worse. And that's why I think there is so, you know, there is significant, people don't like change, but when the change or the need for change isn't explained to them, they like it even less, to the point of hating it. And we're in quite a mess in New Zealand with our infrastructure. We've got to find a way to fix that mess. Whether this is the right way or not, it's not my gig to argue.
So I guess just briefly, last quick question is, so what is your view, or what is your issue with Community for Local Democracies and their and the answers that they've come up with?
Well, they had, yeah, I didn't obviously sit in on their presentation and hear the whether things have changed, but the presentation they made to us, and in fairness to C4LD, there was we were all under very tight timeframes. So I don't know if they've developed it. My council's not part of the organisation, so we don't get to see any outcomes from them. But there was essentially a regional CCO model. It was felt that that didn't work for the balance sheet separation, and also CCOs have not really done that well in iwi having a voice there, it was felt. Secondly was a model where my understanding of it in very loose terms was that there would be funds available for those councils who were struggling to reach the money that was needed.
Yeah, the kind of Waka Kotahi,
Waka Kotahi type model, yeah. My view on that is that you're not addressing the problem. If councils have underinvested, you're just going to give them money and continue to invest them. But look, that's a very simplistic view. I would also, there was some issues in their presentation that caused a great deal of upset to iwi in the room, and I'm going to leave it there because it's not my place to speak for iwi, but you may wish to talk to, and I'm sure you are, your local iwi on that. But I'm not going to go into it because I don't speak for iwi, because I'm not Māori.
Thank you. Rob, then Hadley, then the other Rob. So Rob Vinson, then Hadley, then Rob Goldsberry, and then we'll wrap it up, probably.
G'day, Rob. Did you hear my answer before?
I heard most of it. Thank you. My screen seemed to crash, but I don't know whether that happened with everybody else.
Yeah, it was just you.
Was it?
Just you. You're special.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, you know, you just briefly talked about iwi. You may not know, Tim, that it was iwi representatives on the Ruapehu Council that moved the resolution to join C4LD, and it was iwi representatives that were leading that charge about not subscribing to the government model. So iwi are not united on this either.
That's
what I
suggested
wanted to ask you though.
Sorry, carry on, Rob.
What I wanted to ask you was LGNZ commissioned Castalia, as I said, back as early as 2013. I read that report and they talked about the case for change. And the conclusion was that 16% of councils in New Zealand do not have enough funding in their forward planning for wastewater and 20% for stormwater. So we're talking about a councils of the 67 in New Zealand. That's my problem. The case for change hasn't been properly established. And no matter where LGNZ are going with this issue, the case for change is not established to the extent that all 67 councils in New Zealand need to have the same solution. Okay, and I would like to ask you why you consider there is such a massive case for change of this magnitude for our three water system.
Thank you, Rob. I'll just say that Castalia also acknowledged the case for change. So Tim's not the only one who'll have to justify that. So Tim.
Oh, look, firstly, my opinion probably doesn't count for all that much, but I look at it, what is it that we had, I think it was 553 illegal wastewater discharges last year across the country. Only a handful of those were any action taken on. We've got quite a number of unswimmable beaches in the country at various times, primarily up north. They're too cold to swim at down here. There's a lot of problems in our system. There's one of the things that really gets me is we've got 67 different ways of doing everything. I'm bemused as to why that is. You know, it seems that every time I need a new wastewater plant, well, there's got to be a design done. Well, why can't you just get a 10,000 person plant? But then I'm not an engineer, so what do I know? You've got different wastewater costs based on different councils. So regionally, it goes from about 1,200 down to 140. You've got different water costs. It can go from, I think it's about $1,000 up to 2,300. There's a lot of things that's broken in the system. And I haven't really looked at whether the case for change is there or not, beyond all the parties seem to agree that there's a case for change, that we need to do things differently. We've got, and I look at my own situation and go, whilst we're doing really well on the drinking water front and our pipes are in really good shape, one of my biggest towns had a boil water notice last year. That's not on. You know, we're still playing catch up. You know, we're all pretty untidy when our pants come down on this one, I think. But we can also argue that no, we look pretty good. It depends on how you look at it. But I'm not hearing a lot of argument out of the other major political parties that there isn't a need for change here.
Thank you. Hadley.
Thank you. Just with the couple of questions, just for the case for change, do you think it's more just the fact that it's taking time to catch up on changes of regulations? So, for example, from what I remember, Wanganui was pumping sewage into the river in the 90s. And then we got a pump station we pumped out to sea for 10 years. And then we needed to have a wastewater treatment plant. And all those violations that you mentioned, probably they would have been totally legal 30 years ago or something. So is it more a situation of we're all trying to catch up to get to grips with changes of legislation?
Yeah, you're bang on there, Hadley. That's the big part of it. So if you take your drinking water, the standards haven't changed, but now you've got Te Mata Arawai enforcing them and enforcing them with awfully big stick. So you've suddenly got to play catch up. We budgeted from our 2018 LTP, it was going to take us 10 years to get all our drinking water compliant, and we were already disinfecting. So that's a big catch up there. So yeah, that's it. The law that's to come of the not discharging into any water bodies, that's going to take a lot of catch up into the future. But the third leg of the trifecta for me is the council underinvestment. And you can't have, you've got Wellington Water in their last LTP had 40 burst pipes a week. You know, that's down to old infrastructure that in many cases, and I'm not having a crack at the Wellington councils here because I'm not part of them, I don't know, but in many cases, it's pretty easy for councils to forget the things under the ground and do the projects up above that are a bit more popular. There's whether it's the $125 billion or the $180 billion in infrastructure lag that we have, even if that number's, you know, twice overblown, you've still got staggering amounts of money that need to be caught up on. And it's how that money gets paid. The government's argument, and again, I'm not arguing for them, but the government argument is that these entities should run more efficiently, so therefore should be able to lessen that cost. And secondly, that they should be able to get bigger borrowing power. Now, whether they're right in that or not, I don't know. Overseas experience seems to suggest they're not. Castalia, I think, might suggest that they're wrong in it. I don't know, but I think things need to change from where we are now.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Second question.
oh, sorry, Hadley. Also, and the thing that Rob's missing from the 2014 or whenever Castalia report about the shape of waters in New Zealand is that, and that's 7-8 more years of expiring consents, and wastewater treatment plants and operating on expired consents. I mean, how ridiculous! It's the 21st century.
The other thing that I noticed from the Tasmanian model that gets missed in this conversation a lot is that with their big entity, which it is now, they went through a number of iterations, they wound up with one. They actually have designated like apprenticeships and trade schools all the way through, from you leave school right the way through to you're a water engineer. And I look at the problem, I'm sure you've got the same as us. Water engineers are not growing on trees.
And just second question, this has obviously come to a bit of a shock to us, and I don't think anyone's too happy about the way the government's gone about it. And as far as I've been made aware, there's almost universal public outcry against this. But just from your perspective, since you've been involved with this and trying to refine and improve these ideas or whatever, have you felt more comfortable, and are you, have you felt more comfortable about it and think it's a good idea generally? Yeah, the very first time I heard about this idea, I don't know, it must have been about 2017. It was very soon after the coalition government came in. And I jumped up and down and screamed blue murder and said, how dare they? And the very first thing that somebody said to me, could well have been my very wise CEO, was look at it from an Aotearoa New Zealand perspective, not from a Central Otago district perspective. And you might start to see it a bit differently. And from that moment on, I've moved slowly into a position where I'm not fully supportive of the government's model. There are faults in it. I see some really big faults in it that worry me greatly. But I get to a point, the deeper I get into it, the more I go, we're going to have to do something. I don't think it's going to be something small. And there comes a point where, all right, which idea are you going to go with? Because I don't think the country's got the time or the ability. And that's, again, why I was pretty keen to be on this working group. We've been arguing over this for 5 years. It hasn't hit the public's radar for that long. But this conversation's been going on a long time now. We've got to a point where, well, you're going to go back to the drawing board and that infrastructure debt builds up even more. Although, to be fair, I think councils are taking things a lot more seriously now. And we've got Te Mata Arawai that are enforcing the drinking water standards and discharges and so forth. But there is rumours and legends, I think they're right, of the the president, you'd know this, Hamish, the president of LGNZ writing to the Minister of Local Government in 1999 saying, we've got a big problem here. We need to do something about it. Here we are in 2022. We still got, what did I say, 500 and something illegal discharges every year in a country that prides itself on its environmental standards. It's not good enough. Thank you.
Rob Goldsberry, and then I think we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Hamish. Hi, Tim. I'm the General Counsel here. I've just got a question for you about part of the topic that interests me. Earlier on in the media, we saw comments where S&P, Standard & Poor's, was saying that the exposure draft model, you know, the 44 representatives on the RRG for our entity B, was essentially too close to political control of itself, and therefore would restrict the entity's rights, ability to borrow. And I understand from your group's report that S&P made a representation to you. My question is about how did that influence the shareholder model that you came up with, and do you think that that's sort of answered S&P's criticisms?
I wouldn't dare speak for S&P because I'm nowhere near intelligent enough. When they came to talk to us, they were talking at a level that was well out of my pay grade. And regrettably, it's one of those things where well, what about this idea? How would that go? And they can't just go yes or no because there's such complexity, and they need to have it absolutely finessed to know where they're at. The shareholder model actually was thought up after S&P had talked to us, though. They were more talking about keeping that balance sheet separation, and because the shareholder model doesn't go towards control or influence, I don't think it would affect it at all, but I'm cautious about saying that because they are in a very bespoke world of work that I couldn't pretend to know a fraction about.
Perhaps just a quick follow-up. So just to get it clear in my mind then, the media report is right, is it, when it suggests that S&P's concern is that the closer you get to what I might call political control, the less foreign investors, banks are going to be interested in, well, the worse your rating's going to be and the more difficult it is to borrow money.
Yeah.
And having seen that risk, you guys, however that coalesced, have come up with the shareholder model.
No, I agree with the first part of the statement that that's definitely the case, that the closer you get, the more perilous becomes the entity's ability to borrow and the rate that they're able to borrow at, the amount they're able to borrow. But I don't believe the shareholder model, I can only speak for myself, I don't think the shareholder model sprang out of that. The shareholder model was more about concern for the sense in the public that the assets were being stolen from them and so forth. And also that ability to put another layer of protection on the privatisation.
Cool. Thank you very much, Rob. And look, I think that's it. So look, thank you so much for taking time out of your working day, Tim. I can see the background. You're probably out to go muster some sheep in Terrace. So good on you. Say hello to our ex-mayor. I hope he continues to enjoy his time in Cromwell. Well away. Thanks, so yeah, but really appreciate it. One thing I totally agree with you on, Tim, the government couldn't have done a worse job of selling this. Those cartoons were disgraceful. The rollout was muddled, and yeah, look, it was interesting to mention how disappointed I was and others were to the Minister of Local Government, her jaw pushed out in quite a firm way, and I thought, oh, I'm treading on some toes, but I was that angry. But look, I really appreciate it. I think we're all a lot better informed after the last 90 minutes or 100 minutes or so.
I'm glad to help. It's as complex as a Russian novel, this stuff. And it is, it's hard for people in the public to pick it up from headlines. It gets very difficult too when you've got 67 different councils telling 67 different versions of the truth, because we're all speaking our own truth. It's tough stuff. And yeah, totally. It's been a pleasure to try to help.